Could I have your attention, please? I think we're about to start with the luncheon keynote. We're extremely pleased. Edith Ramirez was here a couple of years ago and gave the keynote from this very spot at this very lunch, and I'm delighted that she has agreed to come back. I'm just going to, I think she's well known to all of you. She's the chairwoman of the FTC. She's been on the commission since 2010, and she's been chairwoman of the commission since 2013. So without further ado, I'm delighted to present FTC chairwoman Edith Ramirez.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Tom. I really appreciate the invitation to come back here to Aspen to participate in this week's forum. When I was here 3 years ago, I highlighted the privacy challenges that big data presents and discussed the ways that the Federal Trade Commission is working to safeguard consumer privacy in this time of very rapid technological innovation. A fair amount has happened in the last 3 years since I was here. Back in 2013, the word selfie did not appear in the Oxford English Dictionary. The Apple Watch was not on the market, and the mass production of self-driving cars was still seen as a distant goal. The last 3 years have also given rise to new challenges in privacy. We've seen an explosion of surveillance technologies such as drones and mobile device tracking sensors in retail stores. We've moved from an ecosystem where companies track consumers across websites to one where companies track us across apps and even across devices. And now, many consumer devices and appliances, from your Fitbit to your fridge to your thermostat, are silently talking to one another, collecting data, and transmitting that information to third parties. Even the once private act of reading is generating data about us, as ebook companies track not just what we read, but also how we read, where we start, what passages we skim, reread, or highlight, and whether we actually finish the books we began. But even with these developments, the overarching challenge, fostering technological innovation and growth while protecting consumers' privacy, is a familiar one. Like the gymnasts we watched perform on the balance beam at the Olympics in Rio last week, we must aim to strike the right balance, one that promotes innovation and protects privacy. As new technologies and business models continue to emerge, however, we hear with increasing frequency the claim that technological innovation and big data have rendered certain fundamental tenets of privacy, particularly the idea of consumer consent, outdated and ill-suited for today's digital world. Rather than focus on consent, these big data advocates argue, we should apply use-based approaches that set specified limits on businesses' ability to use the data they've collected, but allow everything else. I disagree. I believe that the principles of transparency and choice that undergird privacy laws around the world, as well as the best practices the FTC advocates, continue to play an important role in protecting consumer privacy. In order to build and sustain trust in the marketplace, consumers should be in the driver's seat when it comes to their personal information. If consumers feel that they have little or no control, there's a risk that they may not embrace the new products and services that companies seek to offer. We already see some evidence that many consumers are opting out of receiving ads altogether, with surveys showing that the number of consumers installing ad blockers is growing. Now, there's no question that there are challenges, but I believe that companies are capable of developing innovative and creative solutions that can not only give consumers more control over their personal information, but also enhance privacy and promote productivity and growth. Before I turn more specifically to what companies can do, let me elaborate on the challenges. With the rise of big data analytics, the proliferation of connected devices, and the emergence of other new technologies, we've seen the marketplace evolve in ways that have significant implications for consumer control. First, it was not all that long ago that there was an inclination to think of privacy as an all-or-nothing proposition. Data was seen as either personally identifiable or not, and privacy protections were designed around clearly defined categories of personally identifiable information. Consumer consent was often seen as either opting into or out of all data collection with no middle ground. But today's landscape is much more complex. Since the Commission released its first report on online behavioral advertising in 2009, the FTC has discussed the increasingly blurred line between PII and non-PII. As consumers use more digital devices and the sophistication of big data analytics increases, it has become significantly easier to identify individuals based on information not traditionally categorized as personal data, making it more difficult to protect their privacy. For example, in a study published last year, researchers examined purportedly anonymized credit card transaction records. They found that with just 4 random pieces of information that could be gleaned from social media and other public records, such as the stores a person shopped at or movies the person rented, they could reassociate 90% of people with their credit card transaction history. As a result of the increased ability to identify consumers, we now regard data as personally identifiable when it can be reasonably linked to a particular person, computer, or device. In many cases, persistent identifiers such as device identifiers, MAC addresses, static IP addresses, and retail loyalty card numbers meet this test. Just as the distinction between PII and non-PII is not black and white, nor are consumer preferences. We know that many companies, including Google, Yahoo, and Axiom, offer tools where consumers do not have to opt out of advertising completely, but can choose on which subjects they would like to receive advertising. These companies have noted that instead of opting out fully, the majority of consumers who use these tools engage with them in a more nuanced way, perhaps choosing to receive traveling and hiking ads, but rejecting other types of ads. As these examples show, as an increasingly wide spectrum of data with different levels of consumer preferences and expectations attached to it gives rise to potential privacy concerns, privacy can no longer be thought of in terms of stark dichotomies. Second, even putting aside practical difficulties like the absence of consumer interfaces for many devices, the sheer number of actors in the digital arena makes it increasingly difficult for consumers to make informed choices and understand where their data is going. In a world of connected devices, consumers often do not know which companies are doing what. On a mobile device, if I have a problem, should I turn to my carrier, my operating system, my device manufacturer, or my app? On a smart TV, I may be getting content from my cable provider or a streaming video provider, such as Amazon or Roku. At the same time, my TV manufacturer and TV apps may also be collecting my information. And of course, companies that interact directly with consumers are just the tip of the iceberg. As the FTC has discussed in our reports on the data broker industry and big data, dozens of companies operate behind the scenes, scooping up our data and using it to provide further insights about us, often in ways that consumers have little or no idea about. In addition to the data broker industry, the modern-day advertising ecosystem includes a number of companies, not only ad networks, but real-time bidding exchanges, supply and demand-side platforms, data aggregators, measurement and analytics companies, and a host of others collecting our data behind the scenes. How is a consumer supposed to know about these companies, let alone make informed choices about them? And does this complex ecosystem allow companies to pass the buck to avoid accountability for privacy and security failings? Third, the increase in the use of big data analytics to gain deeper insights about consumers and predict their preferences has the potential to weaken the effectiveness of consumer choice. As we've seen time and time again, big data is big because of the scale and variety of information that companies can accumulate, but its significance is also magnified because of the sophistication of the analyses that can be applied to seemingly benign bits of information to make inferences about individuals, often sensitive inferences, and to draw conclusions about their lives. These conclusions can have significant consequences for consumers, particularly when the data is used to determine eligibility for things like insurance, housing, and employment. All of these developments raise difficult questions for privacy. Given that companies can use big data analytics to infer information about consumers without their knowledge or consent, how can we ensure the effectiveness of consumer choices? Given the multiplicity of actors involved, how can consumers possibly understand where their information is going and what it's going to be used for? While it may be tempting to conclude, as some do, that the idea of consumer control as a central privacy tenet is outdated and should be abandoned, I believe that consumer control remains paramount. Now, some might say that this view flies in the face of reality. Consumers cannot possibly make informed choices in this complicated era of big data. Companies cannot provide disclosures on devices with no screens, and by relying on consumers to make their own decisions, we're going to cut off valuable sources of data that will have beneficial uses for society. I recognize the challenges, but I think that building consumer trust is essential if we hope to unleash the full potential of big data, and that enabling consumers to control the collection, sharing, and use of their information is key to establishing that trust. Now, let me emphasize that I'm not saying that consumer control is everything. Existing privacy protections rightly reflect a number of use-based restrictions, among them the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which the FTC enforces. And I also agree that we have to continue the conversation about acceptable and unacceptable uses of consumer data. And as the Commission emphasized in a report on big data earlier this year, companies need to be mindful of the limitations of big data analytics and the potential for adverse consequences for consumers, especially low-income and underserved communities. But in my view, consumer control is essential to protecting privacy, and technology can be used to help us achieve it. So what can industry do? I see a distinct role for three types of companies. Companies that offer products and services directly to consumers. Companies that operate behind the scenes, such as data brokers and ad networks, and what I'll refer to as privacy intermediaries. First, companies that offer products and services directly to consumers should be transparent about their data practices and should improve consumers' ability to manage and express their privacy preferences. As the Commission noted last year in our report on the Internet of Things, companies can offer innovative ways to allow consumers to communicate these preferences. These include setup wizards and settings menus through which consumers can make initial choices, as well as dashboards where consumers can revisit and modify their choices. Many social media websites and apps, smartphone platforms, and IoT devices already offer this capability. This type of innovation is promising, and I hope to see more of it in the future. Second, behind-the-scenes entities should also offer and respect consumer choices. Providing choices poses an additional challenge for these entities because consumers may not know who they are. For ad networks, this problem can be addressed by respecting consumer choices that are expressed through platform or browser tools. By way of example, as of February 2016, nearly 17% of consumers used the limit ad tracking setting on their iOS and Android devices. Additionally, surveys suggest that 30 to 50% of internet users delete their cookies every month. Ad networks should refrain from using techniques that circumvent these types of consumer choices. As for data brokers, the FTC has called on these companies to develop a centralized internet portal to identify themselves to consumers, describe their information collection and use practices, and provide links to access tools and opt-outs. This approach would enable consumers to visit a single site to find out what kinds of information data brokers have about them and how to exercise opt-out choices. Finally, I think there's a role for intermediaries to facilitate communication of privacy preferences between consumers and businesses. In other contexts, like the sharing economy, we've seen the value that intermediaries can add to facilitate transactions between buyers and sellers. The range of tools offered by privacy intermediaries might be as simple as privacy comparison charts or guides, akin to a consumer reports for privacy. For an internet-connected TV or car, the tool could describe what categories of data are collected, whether data is shared with third parties, what the uses are, how long the data is retained, and how long the product or device is patched. I understand that some organizations are already exploring these types of tools. Privacy intermediaries might also enable consumers to share their information only with businesses who meet certain criteria they set. This type of tool could include feedback loops and rating systems, which could add an accountability component. Imagine a privacy app that allows me to create an account, specify what information I would like to share, and have companies compete for my business. These intermediaries could also offer tools that allow consumers not only to express privacy preferences, but also to manage them. For example, a team of researchers at Carnegie Mellon are developing what they call a personal privacy assistant. This technology would allow your smartphone to automatically scan Wi-Fi and Bluetooth channels for privacy policies that are being broadcast by other devices, and then would either make determinations on your behalf or prompt you to make decisions. It would be capable of learning the privacy preferences of users over time and autonomously configuring many settings. So you wouldn't have to worry about whether the terms of service for any of your devices changed. Your personal privacy assistant would simply do it for you. Another technical tool for managing privacy preferences is data tagging. Under this approach, consumer preferences could attach to and travel with data. This could be particularly useful as data is passed from consumer-facing entities to data brokers, ad companies, and others. This is the type of innovation that I would like to encourage to help give effect to consumer choices. The FTC also has an important role to play in empowering consumers and ensuring they have control over their personal information. We can do this by continuing to conduct research to ensure that our policymaking efforts appropriately address privacy and security risks as the marketplace evolves. Using our law enforcement authority to ensure that consumer choices are honored and that companies safeguard the consumer data they collect. And helping spur innovation in the creation of tools that help consumers express choices. First, we will continue our research and policymaking efforts to ensure that our recommendations keep pace with innovation. In our reports on the Internet of Things and on data brokers, we've discussed how the principles that we set forth in our 2012 privacy report, privacy by design, improved transparency, and simplified choice, continue to apply in today's world of IoT and big data. It's important, though, that we continue to reevaluate and test our principles against new technologies and business models. This is one of the reasons that we regularly host workshops and have placed a priority on research. In the coming months, as part of our Fall Technology series, we'll be looking at new challenges associated with the growth of ransomware, drones, and smart entertainment systems. We're also examining how multiple companies delivering services on a single connected device interact with one another. For instance, we're collaborating with the Federal Communications Commission to study security updates on mobile devices. We're obtaining information from the operating systems and device manufacturers, while the FCC is asking questions of the carriers. Together, we hope to get a better picture of where the backlogs are in providing security updates and patches. Next year, and the year after that, there will be new challenges. But the FTC will continue to study the issues, solicit input from stakeholders, and calibrate our approach as the marketplace evolves. Second, as a law enforcement agency, we're committed to using our authority to make sure companies are protecting consumer privacy and safeguarding consumer data. A key part of that effort is ensuring that companies honor consumer choices. One recent case against the operator of a large mobile ad network in Moby illustrates the need for continued enforcement in this arena. Moby offered app developers software code to embed in their apps to enable them to serve targeted advertising, including advertising based on geolocation. It represented that its software would only track consumers' locations when consumers had granted access to that information. We alleged that in actuality, Moby had used consumers' geolocation information, which it was able to infer to target ads even when consumers had not granted geolocation permission. We alleged that Moby's actions were deceptive and in violation of Section 5 of the FTC Act. Our message is that companies, even those that do not directly interact with consumers, ignore preferences set by consumers at their peril. And while protecting consumer choices on the front end, we're also seeking to ensure that these consumer choices are not undermined at the back end, as they are when companies' lax data security practices create a risk that consumers' data will fall into the hands of wrongdoers. Our recent case against wireless router manufacturer Asus highlights the importance of pre-launch security testing of IoT devices. There, we allege that the company's failure to test its internet-connected routers prior to launch contributed to several security breaches. We charge that Asus's actions were both deceptive and unfair in violation of Section 5. As the risks of data breaches continue to increase, we will continue to be vigilant in using our enforcement authority to ensure that companies take reasonable steps to safeguard consumer data. Finally, the FTC can also play a role in fostering innovation and incentivizing companies to develop the new privacy tools that I've discussed. We've done this before in the telemarketing arena. Recognizing that technological developments were making it more difficult to combat unlawful robocalls, we sought to spur innovation to this persistent problem. To date, we've conducted 4 public contests offering cash prizes to inventors who proposed technological solutions to the robocall problem. One of the winning solutions to our first challenge, NomoRobo, was made available to consumers, and it now reports having blocked over 117 million robocalls. We're developing similar challenges in the privacy arena. Another way that we can help incentivize innovation and research in the areas of privacy and security is to showcase the work of researchers. As an example, our workshop on disclosures next month will allow researchers to describe mechanisms to test the effectiveness of privacy disclosures, which are critical to providing consumers the opportunity to make informed decisions about their personal information. We've also issued a call for cutting-edge research on a wide range of privacy and security issues to feature in our second PrivacyCon conference in January. Among other areas, we requested research on the use and effectiveness of opt-out mechanisms and other privacy controls, as well as on the development of tools to help businesses detect discrimination in algorithms. The day after PrivacyCon, we'll be hosting a meeting of researchers and entities that fund research. Our aim is to highlight the need for privacy research and help researchers find the resources that they need to explore new alternatives. To close, I want to emphasize once more that by focusing on the importance of consumer control, I'm not suggesting that consumer control is sufficient to address all of the privacy challenges that we face today. Certainly, companies cannot put the onus on consumers to choose among basic privacy protections, nor can they abdicate their responsibility to use reasonable measures to protect consumer data. Companies need to practice privacy and security by design. They need to consider ethical issues in using big data, and they need to refrain from collecting and storing consumer data that they don't need. But I believe that consumer control is a fundamental building block for privacy. Preferences among consumers may vary, and even a single consumer's preferences may vary, depending on the context. The more sophisticated the tools consumers can have to express these preferences, the richer the interaction between consumers and businesses can be. I think this is a goal that's within our reach, and I urge companies to work toward it. Thank you very much. Happy to take some questions.
Chairwoman Ramirez has agreed to take a question. Larry?
Larry White. I don't need this. I was a cheerleader in high school.
I think so.
Oh, it's being recorded? All right. All right.
You can do some cheers after.
Yeah, all right. All right. I'm Larry White. I'm at the NYU Stern School of Business. I was struck by the fact that I didn't hear the words property rights in anything that you said. Now, maybe implicitly you're thinking in terms of property rights, but I would have thought that a property right structure, the consumer has control over his or her data. Anybody wants to use my data, they need my permission, or you define the property rights in some other way. But getting clarity of property rights there's still enforcement, there's still lots of difficulties, but it may clarify thinking about the problem and who has what rights when you think in terms of property rights and the consumer's data. There's a property right lodged somewhere.
I can certainly understand the reason for the question. I have to say that in the way that we approach the issue, I'm thinking more of consumer control and autonomy. The issue of who owns the data, I think, is less of a focus for us at the Federal Trade Commission and less of a focus on my end, because I think that can raise certain complexities, and given that information is being shared in any number of different ways. But I do think that control is paramount, and I think that there is a risk that we won't really be able to innovate, we won't really be able to make full use of big data, we won't be able to really ensure that we can unleash productivity and growth unless we really do make sure that consumers feel that they have control. And I think, to me, consumers, there's no question that consumers care about privacy, but increasingly consumers feel that they don't have control over what's happening and they feel powerless. I don't think that's a good thing for the economy. I don't think that's a good thing for innovation. And so I think we do need to think about it in those terms, but I don't think it's critical that we think about necessarily in terms of who owns the data at what point in time, given the multiplicity of actors that are involved.
So Michael Katz at Berkeley. So in terms of giving consumers control, I'm interested in what you see as the government's role in this, because I understand the part about ensuring transparency and that consumers are informed, but that's far short of having control. And if you don't engage in price regulation, which I'm hoping you're saying you're not going to do, how do you say you're giving people control if you say, fine, you can have complete control over your cell phone and all the applications, it's only going to cost you an extra $5,000. And otherwise, if you want to buy a cell phone at what we think of as the market price, you're going to have to give up all your any rights to anything. That's fine, you have control, you're making a choice, but presumably most people would say that's a meaningless choice.
A few points. Let me again emphasize that I see consumer control as one component of and a building block of privacy. But let me just emphasize that in terms of the role of government, I mean, at a very basic level, we do have the sectoral system in the US, but we don't have privacy protections across the board. At a very basic level, certain companies are not required to provide any information about what data they're collecting, how they're using it, whether they're sharing it. So I believe that at a fundamental level, what we need in the United States is comprehensive legislation that provides privacy protection. In the absence of transparency, a requirement about transparency, we're not going to have any sense of control. So there's an important role for government. No, we're not advocating price regulation, but I do think there is an important need for there to be legislation in this arena. Not only do I think it's important domestically, I think it's really hurting the United States internationally, the fact that we don't have basic legislation in this area. It's very difficult to explain the complexities of our privacy system when we're talking to regulators in Europe, regulators around the world, and we care about providing protection when it comes to privacy, but we also care about flexibility. And it's very difficult to advocate the way that we approach privacy when in the US we're seen to lack even certain basic protections in certain arenas.
Hi, I'm Ed Hurst at BlackBerry. Thank you very much for addressing us. You've been very eloquent in your description of the need for greater measures to protect privacy. And Mike raised the issue of regulation and not obviously avoiding price controls, and you talked about legislation. I'm wondering, there's another role for government, which is by way of example. And to what extent is the FTC or other parts of the government you may influence taking advantage of the commercial products out there that do protect user privacy? For example, your employees may do both work and personal tasks on their phone. To what extent are you taking advantage of the products out there which will help track what apps are doing and other ways they manage your mobile devices to protect privacy and security?
What I can tell you is that internally we regard the issue of safeguarding information, and we have, of course, as we do our job, we get access to all sorts of confidential information, including personal information. And you can imagine that it's an issue that I pay very close attention to. I don't think that we're at a point where we're necessarily, fully maximizing maybe the way that increasing our efficiencies based on the use of data analytics. I think we have a ways to go in that regard. But I can tell you that internally, the issue of the protection of information is absolutely paramount. In addition, given the limitations that do exist when it comes to protecting privacy, we're very active when it comes to making recommendations in terms of best practices, reaching out and providing guidance to small and medium-sized entities who may lack information about how they can go about providing greater privacy protection as well as data security in particular, which I think is one of the really central issues and central challenges that we face as a society.
Hi, Ed Black, CCIA. First of all, much of what you say we agree with and support strongly. I think there is, however, when you get into some advocates of the most strongest privacy arena, especially we've witnessed in Europe, there is an inherent conflict between privacy and the right to know, the right to have information, that's public domain information, for example. A lot of us are very troubled by the right to be forgotten concept. And I wonder how, I don't really think that's in the center of what you've been talking about at all, but it is out there as a big issue. And how are people supposed to deal with what is an increasing concept that people think they can alter fundamental facts about that are connected to them, described about them, that are in the public domain? It seems to me that's a threat that undermines the legitimacy of real good privacy regulation.
I agree with you that there are significant challenges and difficulties with the concept of a right to be forgotten. I mean, here in the United States, I think that type of a broad right framed in those terms would be at odds with our First Amendment. So I think I would take a much different approach. But I think we also have to recognize, again, I think this goes back to my earlier point about, the influence in particular that Europe has been having around the globe, to the extent that we feel that we, as the U.S., want to advocate for more flexible, more nuanced approaches to these issues. I think one thing that we need to do is to have companies be, cognizant of and make sure that they're protecting privacy where they can. But I think fundamentally that we need legislation both in the area of privacy and data security. But I absolutely see, difficulties with that concept, an expansive concept of the right to be forgotten.
Alan Rawls, Sidley Austin. Chairwoman Ramirez, in your remarks you talked about collaboration with your sister agency, the Federal Communications Commission, with regard to the different players in the internet and digital ecosystem where you have respective jurisdiction. Recently, the Federal Communications Commission proposed certain privacy rules, and the FTC staff, I think it was a staff comments as opposed to the commission, submitted very thoughtful comment letter to the FCC indicating certain areas in which there appeared to be a divergence in the approach that the FCC was proposing and that which the Federal Trade Commission has been administering for a long time now, one which is based on an enforcement-based approach as opposed to the rules-based approach that the FCC is proposing. And specifically, there was a distinction noted between the treatment of sensitive information, where the FTC staff said that the FCC privacy rules didn't seem to make relevant distinctions between sensitive and non-sensitive information. And on data breach, you were just speaking about data security, the FTC comment letter suggested that there was a risk of over-notification if the FCC were to finalize rules in accordance with its current proposal, because they were not, again, drawing the distinction in the type of data involved. So my question would be, do you see a risk of divergence here? Does it make sense to have, different rules for the different players in the same ecosystem? And as I think you indicated in your remarks, kind of consumers are dealing with, different devices and different content providers and so on, but really they're looking at it kind of as a seamless web. So do you see a risk of divergence if the FCC goes in a different direction from the FTC?
Let me start by saying that I'm very supportive of the FCC working to enhance consumer privacy in the area of broadband. But there are certain consequences to their decision to reclassify, and one consequence is that the FTC no longer has jurisdiction over broadband providers. And I do think that there is risk of negative consequences if you have divergence. We're doing our best to collaborate with the FCC, and frankly, we collaborate with a number of other agencies who now are playing a role in privacy, given that there's so many sister agencies out there that in the past had never been dealing with issues relating to privacy, including the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, as they have to deal with connected cars, et cetera. So I think it's important for us to collaborate, share our expertise. And as you noted there, in the staff comment, we did note that there were certain areas at line drawing that where we do differ. So, for example, we believe that it's appropriate to require opt-in consent when you have when it comes to sensitive information like financial information, geolocation, children's information, health information, content. But in areas outside of that, we think that opt-out choice would suffice. So we're collaborating. We've conveyed our view as to how we would strike that balance between protection and also ensuring that we continue to allow innovation and growth. And I think it's going to be important for us to continue moving forward. I think one way of rectifying perhaps greater divergence would be that and the Commission advocates for the elimination of the common carrier exception so that we would have jurisdiction over common carriers. Another way to also would be going back to the point that I made earlier, where if you have basic privacy laws across the board, you then wouldn't have a discrepancy between, or as large a discrepancy between what the FCC might ultimately require in its any regulation as compared to companies that are outside of the FCC's jurisdiction. So it is a concern, and we're going to continue to do our best to share our expertise and demonstrate, I think, the approaches that we think work, and that will continue. But I do have concerns that it certainly isn't optimal to have divergent rules, and I think ultimately Congress does need to work toward this. And one way is by having across the board privacy laws.
Baron Soka, Tech Freedom. I don't think anybody would ever accuse me of cheerleading the FTC, but let me be the first to cheer you on today for having used the term privacy intermediary and for laying out a vision of a different world where instead of being focused on does a single point of disclosure work for everybody, do we have the right nutrition label that works for everybody, how do we build the right sort of disclosure framework so that people can innovate upon that and build transparency that works for different users and allow people to choose directly. People like me have been saying that for a long time. I've never heard that come from the agency, so I think this is really important that you're laying out that vision today. And I'm curious, how do you see the agency's role in using its bully pulpit to promote those ideas, to, just as it has for many years, pushed a different paradigm of being focused just on a single version of disclosure, a single set of the privacy policy or maybe a nutrition label? How do you see the commission, not necessarily instead of those things, but as a supplement to them, encouraging innovation, encouraging research, encouraging people to think about the idea that maybe we don't have to have a single set of disclosures for everybody. Maybe we have machine-readable disclosures that then allow innovators to develop the sorts of tools that you described, that choose for people based on people's expressions of their preferences. And in particular, I know you mentioned the September workshop. That workshop seems very focused on measuring the efficacy of those older paradigms. And I know there's a panel at the end about the future of disclosure, but it's not apparent from that the discussion is going to really get into this vision of intermediated disclosure. So is it, or is the commission going to do an additional workshop, and how will we see the commission engage on that idea?
There's no paradigm shift here. The commission has always advocated a flexible approach to privacy protection. The agency has also always placed a priority on research, on being innovative. I think this is becoming ever more important given the pace of innovation, given the pace of technological change. And for me, that's been a very significant priority, that we continue to make investments in research. We've always engaged with stakeholders. That's going to continue. But we do recognize that it's important, and as I said, it's important for us to constantly evaluate and test the way that we're looking at these issues. And so I think what I see as doing moving forward is advocating greater use of technological tools to help us deal with the challenges that we're facing when it comes to privacy protection. So in my view, it's not any kind of a significant paradigm shift, but rather a continuation of us advocating flexibility and not being prescriptive, but really placing an emphasis on the need to constantly reevaluate, engage in more research so that we can deepen our understanding and be even more effective as an agency.
Nicole Turner-Lee from the Multicultural Media Telecom and Internet Council. Chairwoman, really good to hear what you're talking about today. Thank you for being here. Thanks, TPI, for having you. I just wanted to follow up on a quick question on where you are with the work that you came out pretty strongly with a couple years ago on the predictive analytics piece in terms of discriminatory algorithms, et cetera. And, has the commission experienced results? I mean, I think the report a couple years ago and the one that's recently really came out pretty strong about the civil rights component of those behaviors, and whether or not, in line with the thinking that you've sort of introduced today, if there's opportunity to do more of a collaborative framework to help companies as well as consumers to be able to identify those types of discriminatory behaviors.
You referenced the report that we issued on big data earlier this year, where we do provide recommendations, and we want to make sure that the companies recognize, right, the limits of big data analytics, that recognize the limits of analyses, risks that can be raised simply by having inaccurate or incomplete information. One thing that we are doing is in connection with these efforts that I noted to urge greater research and greater tools to examine these. One of our calls for research is precisely in the development of tools that can help businesses detect biases. So I specifically referenced one. There's actually some presentations on it in our PrivacyCon conference this year. We're asking for more. So yeah, so the goal is that we do want to urge researchers, we want to urge the development of tools to help identify areas where there might be potentially negative or adverse consequences for certain communities of consumers.
Well, let me. You've taken a lot of questions, but let me. Is this on or yeah? So let me ask the last question. You've now been on the commission since 2010, which is a fairly long time in the history of the internet, and I'm just wondering what you have observed or what the commission staff has observed about changes in attitudes on the part of consumers towards privacy on the internet. I mean, how it's evolved and how that might affect how the FTC approaches its task in this regard.
The landscape has changed significantly, and let me speak about this mainly in terms of the attitudes, frankly, of companies. When I first joined the agency, I think companies were, and the arguments that I would hear was this notion or this idea that privacy protection was in conflict and at odds with innovation. And many companies would question whether consumers actually cared about privacy. I think we're in a much different place today. A lot of that is a consequence of the Snowden revelations, and I think it became very clear and is very clear today to most business leaders that consumers do care about privacy, that it's something that they need to pay attention to. I think there's a lot more work that we need to do in order to really fully understand consumer attitudes about privacy, and also how we're still in early days in terms of how companies use data. And so these are issues that we, as at the FTC, because of both of our consumer protection mission as well as our competition mission, are going to be continuing to study. And I think we're in a unique position to study them because of the dual mission that we have. And so I think it's going to continue to be interesting times, and I think the FTC will continue to be at the forefront of these issues.
Thank you very much for a great talk.
Thank you.